What if the most powerful country in the world today was, just a little over a century ago, being sold drugs by foreign governments, carved up like a piece of land nobody owned, and left so broken that its own people called it the sick man of Asia? That country is China, and the story of how it fell, survived, and came roaring back is one of the most dramatic reversals in all of human history. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand modern China in a way that most people in the West simply do not. Let's go back to the early 1800s. China, at this point, is not some struggling developing nation. It is the center of the world in a very real sense. The Qing dynasty rules over the largest empire on the planet by population. Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, tea, are the luxury items every European aristocrat wants on their shelves. The emperor governs from the Forbidden City, a palace complex so grand and so deliberately isolated from the outside world that its very name tells you everything about how China saw itself. They believed they were the civilized world and everyone else was on the outside looking in. Here's the problem with that kind of confidence. It can blind you. While China was looking inward, proud of everything it had built, Europe was going through the Industrial Revolution. Steam power, mass production, modern weapons, fast ships. The gap between Western military capability and what China had was growing every single decade, and the Qing court had very little idea how serious that gap had become. They thought foreign nations should feel honored just to be allowed to trade with China. That attitude was about to collide with brutal reality. Britain by this point was absolutely addicted to Chinese tea. Not metaphorically, I mean economically dependent on it. Millions of pounds worth of tea were being imported every single year. The issue was that China did not want British manufactured goods in return. They wanted payment in silver, hard currency draining British reserves and creating a massive trade imbalance. This was something British merchants and the British government found completely unsustainable. So they came up with a solution. And it was as cynical and morally bankrupt as anything in modern history. British merchants, operating under the protection of the British East India Company, started shipping opium from British-controlled India into China. The drug was illegal in China, but that did not stop the trade. It was smuggled in by the ton, building a massive black market that spread through Chinese society. At first, it was mostly wealthy Chinese who fell into addiction, but the trade expanded rapidly, and soon opium was spreading through all layers of Chinese society. Soldiers were becoming addicted, farmers were abandoning crops, entire communities were hollowed out, while silver flowed out of China and into the hands of British merchants. The country that had once been flush with wealth was being economically drained through deliberate mass addiction. The Qing government recognized the catastrophe unfolding before them. In 1839, Emperor Daoguang sent an official named Lin Zexu to the port city of Canton with orders to end the opium trade by whatever means necessary. Lin was not someone who messed around. He wrote directly to the British Crown, asking how any civilized nation could justify poisoning another country's people for profit. He received no response. He then seized over 1,000 tons of opium from British merchants and destroyed every last bit of it. Britain's answer to this was not diplomacy, it was warships. The First Opium War ran from 1839 to 1842. On paper, China had a massive military. In practice, British forces had steam-powered gunboats, modern artillery, and rifles, generations ahead of anything the Qing military possessed. Chinese troops were brave, but they were fighting with swords and outdated muskets against an industrial war machine built on modern technology. British ships sailed up Chinese rivers almost unchallenged, bombarding coastal cities and destroying whatever resistance they encountered. It was not a war in any balanced sense of the word. It was a demonstration of technological dominance. China was forced to accept the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, and the terms were humiliating. China had to pay Britain an enormous sum in silver compensation, open 5 ports to British trade, and hand over Hong Kong permanently. The wound was deep, but it was only the beginning. Less than 15 years later, a second conflict erupted. The Second Opium War, with Britain joined by France, resulted in even greater devastation across China. In 1860, British and French forces marched all the way to Beijing and carried out one of the most infamous acts in Chinese historical memory. The Old Summer Palace, an enormous complex filled with centuries of art, manuscripts, and cultural treasures, was looted and then burned to the ground. The fire burned for days, and what had once represented Chinese civilization at its most magnificent was reduced to ruins. The ruins still stand in Beijing today, deliberately left unrestored as a permanent reminder of what happened. The treaties that followed forced China to open more ports, allow foreign diplomats to operate inside Beijing, legalize the opium trade, and pay enormous financial reparations. Foreign powers could operate their own legal systems on Chinese soil, meaning foreigners could commit crimes in China and face no Chinese consequences. Chinese people in their own country were often treated as second-class residents under foreign control. The phrase reportedly appearing on signs in some areas, "No dogs" or "Chinese allowed," became one of the most enduring symbols of this era. The following decades became known as the Century of Humiliation, covering the period from the First Opium War until 1949. Once the weakness of the Qing dynasty became clear, every ambitious power wanted a piece of China. France took control of Vietnam. Russia annexed large territories in the north. Germany claimed influence in Shandong. Japan, rapidly modernizing and hungry for empire, looked at China and saw opportunity. China was not colonized the way India was. Instead, multiple foreign powers controlled different regions through spheres of influence. There was no single oppressor to resist. The Chinese state was simply being pulled apart from every direction simultaneously. The Qing dynasty tried to respond with the self-strengthening movement, attempting to adopt Western technology without abandoning Chinese culture. They built shipyards, purchased modern weapons, and sent students abroad to study in Europe and America. But the reforms were half-hearted, poorly funded, and constantly undermined by political struggles inside the imperial court. The Empress Dowager Cixi, who held enormous influence, was more focused on maintaining her own power than transforming the country. By 1900, popular frustration had reached a boiling point. A militant movement known as the Boxers, fueled by anti-foreignist sentiment and belief in supernatural protection from bullets, attacked foreigners and Chinese Christians. In a catastrophic decision, the Qing court supported them. 8 foreign nations formed a military coalition and invaded China. Beijing was occupied again, and the Qing government was forced to sign yet another devastating agreement. The reparations demanded were so enormous they exceeded the entire annual revenue of the Chinese government. The dynasty's credibility collapsed completely, and ordinary Chinese people understood that their government could no longer protect them. Before moving forward, if this video made you stop and think, then the conversation doesn't end here. Leave a comment below and tell me what topic you want us to go deeper into next. This channel exists to break down what most people are never told, and your questions shape what comes next. If you want to understand these shifts before they become obvious to everyone else, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications, because what's coming won't be explained on the evening news, but it will be explained here. In 1911, it collapsed. The revolution that ended the Qing dynasty and established a Chinese republic was led by figures including Sun Yat-sen, and it was celebrated as a new beginning. That celebration did not last long. Without a strong central authority, the country fragmented almost immediately. Regional warlords seized power across different provinces, while the central government, in name, had almost no real control in practice. Peasants starved. Infrastructure fell apart. The republic that was supposed to be China's fresh start turned into something close to a failed state, with violence and instability spreading across vast regions. And then came Japan. In 1931, Japanese forces moved into Manchuria in China's northeast. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion that would plunge China into years of devastation. What followed over the next 8 years was a conflict of almost incomprehensible brutality. Entire cities were bombed flat, villages burned, and civilian suffering reached levels difficult to describe. The Nanjing Massacre in late 1937 and early 1938 saw Japanese soldiers kill somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war in just weeks. The violence was systematic, deliberate, and documented in horrifying detail by foreigners who were present in the city at the time. The scale and cruelty shocked even outside observers. Japan also conducted biological and chemical weapons experiments on Chinese prisoners. Entire communities were destroyed, and the scale of suffering during those 8 years is difficult to put into words. But something important was happening beneath all of that suffering. Chinese people who had been divided by warlord politics and civil war began to unite against a shared enemy. The ongoing conflict between the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong was temporarily overshadowed by the larger struggle against Japanese invasion. The experience of resisting that invasion began forging something that had been missing for decades, a unified Chinese national identity built on shared suffering and shared resistance. World War II ended in 1945 and Japan was defeated. But China's internal civil war resumed almost immediately between the nationalists and the communists. By 1949, the Communist Party had won. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government fled to Taiwan, leaving the mainland under the control of Mao Zedong and his forces. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square in Beijing and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. The words he used that day have echoed through Chinese politics and culture ever since. The Chinese people have stood up. It was a statement that only made sense in the full context of everything that had come before. After a century of invasion, exploitation, humiliation, and fragmentation, China was finally unified again. The country was desperately poor, its infrastructure devastated, and its population exhausted, but it was unified and sovereign once more. That fact mattered enormously. The Communist Party immediately turned the Century of Humiliation into a central pillar of modern Chinese national identity. It is taught in detail in every Chinese school, reinforced through textbooks, national museums, and historical exhibitions across the country. The memory of that period is not allowed to fade, and that is entirely deliberate. It serves as the historical foundation for the Communist Party's political legitimacy. The argument presented by the party is straightforward. Weak governments allowed China to be exploited and humiliated by foreign powers. The Communist Party restored national dignity and unity, and only the continued strength of the party can ensure those humiliations never happen again. That narrative has real consequences for how China behaves in the modern world. The massive expansion of Chinese military power is framed as a guarantee that no foreign nation will ever again invade Chinese territory. The relentless focus on economic development is rooted in the understanding that poverty made China vulnerable in the first place. China's hardline positions on Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea are filtered through the lens of a nation that once lost pieces of itself to foreign powers. From that perspective, protecting territorial control is not simply politics. It is preventing the return of humiliation. Under Mao, China launched radical economic and social experiments that produced catastrophic results for the population. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution together caused enormous suffering and millions of deaths across the country. After Mao died in 1976, Deng Xiaoping led China in a radically different direction. He opened the country to foreign investment and market-oriented economics while maintaining single-party political control. Deng described this model as socialism with Chinese characteristics. What followed was the fastest sustained economic growth in recorded human history. Over roughly 4 decades following Deng's reforms, hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens were lifted out of poverty. Cities that barely existed grew into massive global metropolises connected to international trade networks. China became the manufacturing engine of the world. By 2010, China had the second largest economy on the planet. Today, its economic output and influence over global trade, infrastructure development, and financial systems rival the United States directly. Modern China is deeply focused on proving its resurgence to the world and to itself. Major projects like the Olympics, the National Space Program, and the Belt and Road Initiative carry meaning beyond simple economic policy. They are statements of recovered national greatness. Xi Jinping often speaks about what he calls the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. The idea is that China is reclaiming the powerful position in the global system that it once held before the Century of Humiliation. And crucially, this is not just government messaging that ordinary Chinese citizens ignore. National pride in China's resurgence is widespread and genuinely felt by large portions of the population. When Western governments criticize China over human rights, trade practices, or territorial disputes, many Chinese citizens interpret that criticism in a very different way. Instead of seeing it as principled concern, they often see echoes of the same arrogance that preceded the Opium Wars. From that perspective, foreign powers once again appear to be telling China what it is allowed to do within its own borders. This is the key point that people in the West frequently fail to grasp. The Century of Humiliation is not distant history that Chinese citizens are irrationally clinging to. It remains an active framework through which modern political events are interpreted. When China refuses to compromise on Taiwan, conceding territory would feel like repeating the humiliations of the 19th century. When China pushes back aggressively against criticism from foreign governments, it reflects the belief that weakness invites exploitation. The Communist Party's survival is directly tied to its promise that China will never again be weak enough to suffer that fate. This historical memory also explains the persistent tension between China and Japan. When Japanese politicians visit shrines honoring individuals convicted of war crimes, it triggers enormous anger in China. That reaction is not simply political manipulation. For many Chinese families, the memories of the Japanese invasion remain extremely real and emotionally present. Meanwhile, in Britain, public awareness of the Opium Wars and Britain's role in flooding China with opium remains remarkably limited. That imbalance in historical memory creates a major diplomatic misunderstanding. China carries a vivid and emotionally charged memory of events that many Western societies barely remember. China was genuinely wronged in ways that are difficult to overstate. The deliberate flooding of a country with an addictive drug to correct a trade imbalance was morally indefensible. The destruction of the Summer Palace represented an act of cultural devastation. The Japanese invasion produced some of the worst documented atrocities of the 20th century. These events are not disputed by historians. They happened. At the same time, the China of today is not the weak and fragmented country of the 19th century. It is a nuclear-armed superpower with the world's largest standing military and an economy that affects billions of lives. The question facing historians, policymakers, and global leaders is how a nation shaped by humiliation and recovery will behave in the future. Some analysts argue that China primarily wants security, stability, and recognition as an equal power within the global system. Others believe that a national identity built on humiliation and restoration may produce ambitions that go beyond simple defense. What is not in dispute is this: if you want to understand why China acts the way it does today, you cannot begin with current events. You have to start in 1839, when British ships first sailed into Chinese waters carrying opium and imperial ambition. The dragon was wounded, almost fatally. It survived, it recovered, and today it is stronger than it has been in 2 centuries, but it has not forgotten a single moment of what happened. A combination of immense power and long historical memory is what makes China one of the defining geopolitical stories of our time. Understanding where it came from is the only way to understand where it might be going. This is just one piece of the bigger picture. Subscribe if you want to understand the full context and how to better protect yourself in uncertain times. And the video on screen takes this story one step further.